Isuzu were best known for their commercial vehicles, trucks, vans, lorries, and what have you. However, there was a time where they built normal passenger cars for normal people. However, some of these cars were a bit spicy. There were some fast cars, some cars that had pre-tuned variants from factory, and some cars that were breathed upon by Lotus. So this is a brief history of how Isuzu came to make sports cars. Isuzu had started making cars after the war. In fact, they started with rebadged Hillmans. However, they then quickly moved on in the 50s to making their own cars, styled after European and American saloons. This was the first fast one, the Bred. This was designed to look like a Bristol, and it actually does, to be fair. It was available as a coupe or as a saloon, and about midway through the 60s, a high-performance version was released to commemorate touring car racing, the Isuzu Bred GT Type R. This had 115 horsepower, rear-wheel drive, and a manual gearbox. And it was actually quite good in racing. In fact, there is one that still goes around Goodwood today, which is pretty cool. However, they weren't that successful, so they decided to go into another type of racing, which was considerably more extreme. Group 6. Why? I don't know. But they took the engine from the Bred and fitted it into this, which is a pretty cool looking racing car. But again, that wasn't that successful. And neither were their attempts to do Group 7, which was even less successful. So they decided to quit racing altogether and focus more on road cars. About 5 years later, Isuzu went ahead and built their first ever halo car, the 117 Coupe. This sporty GT was styled after the Fiat Dino and was designed to compete against other Japanese sports cars such as the Mazda RX-7. This thing was a really cool looking car. And honestly, performance wasn't too bad either. The 2-litre twin cam, 135 horsepower, could reach 60 in 9.5 seconds, which was pretty much on par with most other Japanese sports cars at the time. However, they did do something weird with it. They fitted it with a diesel engine, and this was the first time that anyone had ever put a diesel engine in a sports car. And that was the problem. They quickly found out why. It just didn't work. It only had 72 horsepower and the car itself could only do 80 miles an hour. And that meant that this was one of the slowest sports cars ever made. It also wasn't particularly responsive and was a bit more of just a city runabout. In 1974, Isuzu released their most popular passenger car, the Gemini. And this car lasted ages. In fact, it lasted all the way until 2000. This first generation car had a spicy ZZR variant with 130 horsepower, and that meant that it was as fast as the fast Escorts in Europe. However, it didn't quite make it to Europe. In fact, it mainly stayed in Japan and Australia. This car you may be familiar with if you watch Mighty Car Mods, as Marty used it to go up against Moog, who was driving a 1970s Datsun 240Z. However, later on, as this car evolved, it became more advanced, and where it peaked was in 1993 when Isuzu released this, the Irmscher R. This was developed using Irmscher, an in-house tuning company who later went on to specialise in Opels. This thing had developed styling, kind of looked like an Evo. It also had four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, and an intercooler. It was also one of the most powerful cars that Isuzu ever made. 180 horsepower, which I admit does not sound like a lot, however that was still enough for it to compete with the Mitsubishi Lancer GSR and the Honda Integra SI. So this thing was actually pretty good. It handled well too. In fact, it set a 4-minute and 2-second time on the Gunside 2-gate road, which isn't that quick, But honestly, having a time on that road in the first place is pretty impressive nonetheless. It's still a good car, this. There weren't many made. I think there were only 50 Ultra-R competitions, which were the even more hardcore version that was used to homologate a rally car. In 1980, Isuzu released this, the Piazza. This was their most iconic coupe. Turbocharged, rear-wheel drive, pop-up headlights. In theory, this thing was perfect. In fact, it was so good that they decided to sell it in the UK. So one dealer in West Bromwich decided to buy them and sell them to the public. However, they were too expensive, and as a result, the dealer promptly went bust. So sales flopped. As a result, there are only 10 left in the UK, and that's a shame. Everywhere else, however, this car sold relatively slowly as well. In fact, it was sold in Australia as a Holden and also as a Chevrolet in America. And this meant that Isuzu was now able to conquer a much more global market thanks to this car and also thanks to the Trooper. This thing was able to keep up with other Japanese sports cars like the RX-7 thanks to its 180 horsepower turbo, which was detuned to 140 everywhere else. And it was also rear-wheel drive, and that meant that it was actually pretty fun to drive on twisty roads. Before we get on to the last car, I just want to explain that Isuzu was the owner of Lotus in the 90s. In fact, Lotus took their engine and used it in the Elan M100, which was a pretty good car. And in return, they tuned the suspension of a lot of their sports cars that I've mentioned before, and they even tuned the suspension on their SUVs such as the Trooper. For some reason, I don't really know why, but some people felt that maybe that their car could handle a bit better and had less of a tendency to roll over. In 1993, Isuzu was struggling. However, they weren't ready to give up just yet. They released the Impulse. This was the second generation Piazza. This was probably one of their coolest designs. I love the pop-up headlights and also the shape of it just looks really cool. It has the intercooled turbo engine from the Gemini, it has all-wheel drive as well, and still has 4 seats. It was a bit of a flop. They weren't that popular, however they were very cheap, which made them a pretty interesting choice for younger buyers. However, being an obscure brand, they just didn't take off, and that's honestly a shame, because a car that looks like this is just such a cool thing to drive. However, that wasn't enough to save Isuzu's passenger cars, as they quickly died off, and by 2000 they were gone completely. Isuzu was never to make a passenger car ever again.